And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Dr. Jeffrey Long, who founded the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation over 20 years ago. Dr. Long has investigated over 4,000 NDEs, which is by far the largest number of NDEs ever scientifically studied. The results of his previous research were published in the New York Times bestselling book Evidence of the Afterlife, The Science of Near-Death Experiences, and millions of people have also seen Dr. Long on TV shows like The Today Show, The Dr. Oz Show, National Geographic Television, History Channel, and even The O'Reilly Factor. Dr. Long, thank you so much for joining me today, and welcome.
Well, Jeff, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. We've got lots to talk about.
Dr. Long, how did you first get interested in NDEs in the first place? Did you have one, or at least an OBE?
I've never had a near-death experience. I was decades ago studying in my residency training for my medical specialty of radiation oncology, and I was at the medical library. This was pre-internet, so we had these big old thick honking volumes that we had to look up journal articles. And there I am looking up my cancer-related article, and completely by accident, there was an article I accidentally discovered that had the term near-death experience in it. And I stopped. I was puzzled. My entire medical training told me you're either you're either dead or you're not dead. And I'd never even heard of near-death experience. So puzzled, I stopped and read the article and was immediately fascinated. I mean, gosh, Jeff, how can you not be fascinated about what happens when we die? So here was a cardiologist, Dr. Sabom, describing his research where people had an NDE, near-death experience, consciousness went apart from their body, and what they described while they were clinically dead, absolutely accurate to the finest details. So I was amazed and thought to myself, if this is real, near-death experiences are real, this changes my view of the universe. And I read a little bit about near-death experience, but then several years later, I was a little bit of a computer geek, so I had finished my residency, had some free time, and set up the website that you mentioned, the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation on NDERF.org. I was a bit of a skeptic at that time. My burning question was, are NDEs for real? So I set up a survey and set up a very detailed website to answer that question. And after I received my first few dozen near-death experiences, that question was unequivocally answered. Yeah, near-death experiences are, in a word, real. And that started my journey of discovery, of learning, that has extended all the way up today, over 20 years later.
I know that you're an oncology radiologist, but perhaps even when you did your rounds in residency, did you ever happen to come across somebody that had an NDE?
I did my radiation oncology residency back in the early to mid 1980s, and that was way before near-death experience was a household word. So we didn't really hear about that. Now today, in my practice, and I'm still practicing full time, we periodically have either patients or family members with them that say, Dr. Long, I've Googled you, I know who you are, and I'll bet you're interested in this. And then they share their personal near-death experience, and that's fascinating, and we talk about that. So it's a real positive way I can reach out to both patients and their family members and support their near-death experience accounts that they share.
Well, over 4,000 cases that you've studied, what is new in your research?
Wow, good question. Even after all these years, I'm still learning. It's still what we don't know, Jeff, outweighs what we do know about near-death experiences. So we're still, me and the other researchers of near-death experience and people that have an interest in it, we're all literally pioneers. For instance, just within the last few months, somebody looked at the near-death experiences we had posted on the website and discovered that about 10% of all near-death experiences had as part, typically at the end of their near-death experience, you need to go back. Your work's not done. There's more for you to do. And that seemed to be the same communication from the other side with beings with them, whether they were near-death experiences were shared in English or non-English. So all around the world, cross-culturally, this seems to be a very common characteristic, an element of what occurs during near-death experiences, which nobody really had characterized right up until that study was done. And right now, I'm reviewing a paper from my colleague, researcher in Iran, who's studying Muslim near-death experiences, and again, finding that That when people have a near-death experience, they greatly increase their understanding that life is meaningful, which is consistent with the research I've done here in typical Western near-death experiences.
I've had a couple guests claim to encounter Muhammad during their NDE. Has he mentioned that at all?
Yeah, I actually asked him about that because and I have portions of our website, our research website, have been translated into over 30 different languages, including Arabic.
That's amazing.
And so as a result of that, we get near-death experiences, scores of them from all around the world, scores even of these accounts from non-Western countries. So I've had a chance to look at a very large number of non-Western NDEs, and I was personally impressed that it seems to be fairly rare that people describe meeting Muhammad in particular. Now, my Iranian researcher I work with, I emailed him curious about that. And he said, for most people that are Muslims in Iran or other parts of that country, other non-Western country Muslims, they would typically be very reluctant to share that they saw Muhammad, even if they thought they did, because of cultural concerns in the country that they're in. So that may be, if you had a guess, that's great. That would be very, very uncommon. Although, yes, I've seen some other people from non-Western countries, Muslims, that have encountered what they believe was Muhammad or mullahs or other religious figures.
On my show, it's a podcast that's a safe place for guests to come and share without judgment from me. But if you look at the comments, there are sometimes people questioning the validity of people's NDEs. And so what I'd like to get from you is, in your opinion, what are the hallmark signs that make sure or that state that this is actually an NDE?
Sure. Um, as a physician and having done this over 20 years and having reviewed over 4,000, we get a pretty strong sense about, what's a real, what's a not real near-death experience. My definition of near-death experience, and is the consensus of many researchers, is that you have to be having a near-death experience at the time you nearly die. In other words, there's an imminent life-threatening event, and then it's at that time that you're having that when you're so physically compromised that you're unconscious or clinically dead, that you have an experience, the near-death experience. So start foundationally with the definition of a near-death experience, and then you have to look as far as what my opinion validates near-death experiences as being real are the lines of evidence for the reality. For example, among the strongest, so here you are, unconscious or clinically dead. One of the initial things that occurs in a near-death experience commonly is what we call an out-of-body experience. Consciousness rises above the body, and from that vantage point, while their physical body lies down there unconscious or dead, they're highly lucid and can be aware of and hear and see ongoing earthly events, often the frantic efforts of people trying to resuscitate them and bring them back to life. Both my studies and other people that have studied this have found that what they see and hear while their body's unconscious or dead is accurate down to the finest details almost all the time. In my study of over 200 of these out-of-body experiences during near-death experiences, that were 98.6% accurate in down to the finest detail of what they're describing. And other researchers have seen that. And in fact, if their consciousness drifts away from just above their body and goes far away, it can go hundreds of yards, even over a mile away. If their consciousness, as occasionally happens in near-death experiences, observes far distant ongoing earthly events, geographically far from their body, way outside of any possible physical sensory awareness, once again, what they see and hear when they check it out later, almost invariably accurate down to the finest details. That absolutely single-handedly is one out of many lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience, excludes physical brain function from being causal. Moreover, even under adequate general anesthesia, people have their heart stop and boom, they have typical near-death experiences. Again, we have scores of that. And for those of you that have ever been under general anesthesia, boom, you're asleep, and then you wake up, and your mind is a complete blank slate. So again, even under general anesthesia, when they have heart stoppage, which is rare, mercifully, and yet very well documented because you have a whole team keeping an eye on you when you're under anesthesia. Once again, typical near-death experiences with all the details. Again, with heart stopping, you shouldn't be able to have a conscious lucid experience. Under anesthesia, shouldn't have an experience. So if you will, that's doubly impossible for a near-death experience to be due to physical brain function, and yet by the scores that people report that. And again, that's just two out of many, many other examples. But that almost those two examples almost single-handedly nail down the brain can't be accounting for near-death experience. Anything the brain does, chemistry, electrical, memories. I mean, you can't explain that from what we as researchers observe.
What about the people who are under severe emotional crisis or severe fear? And I think actually your wife gave me the term, a fear-death experience.
Yep, that's right. The wife was on earlier. Invite you to take a look at what she's a great, great show, by the way. My
Thank you.
wife. We use the term fear-death experience. Other researchers have looked at that. These are people that have a sudden, they think they're going to die, sudden traumatic event. They really fully believe that they're going to die, and yet they're not physically compromised. They're not physically unconscious. They're not clinically dead. They just believe they're going to be, and it's severely frightening. They do have experiences, some of which can be indistinguishable from near-death experiences. I've studied the two groups together, fear-death experiences and near-death experiences, and there is some statistical differences. For example, when you have a fear-death experience, you're suddenly afraid. You sort of have that belief your life flashes before your eyes when you're that afraid. Well, that's actually true. Statistically, fear-death experiences have more of those, what we call life reviews, a higher probability, a higher percentage of life reviews occurring during a fear-death experience as opposed to near-death experience. But understand, fear-death experiences are, if you will, under that overall umbrella of spiritual experiences. Near-death experiences are there. Fear-death experiences can be there. Spontaneous out-of-body experiences can be there. So it's all part of that. Those, if you will, scholarly literature may call it mystical experiences, but helps us to learn that there really is that typically unseen world, universe even around us, that we all have a portal to in these spiritual experiences.
I've not done near as many cases as you have. I've seen about 500 guests on my show that have had NDEs, but I get to a point where I sometimes feel like I'm getting closer to knowing as much as you can about NDEs, and then all of a sudden I get a new guest that brings a completely new piece of the puzzle. Do you feel like you will ever figure it all out?
No, and that's a great question. So I hope you, Jeff, I hope you find this reassuring, even if you do hundreds more. Near-death experiences are, as best we can tell, a glimpse of a greater universe, literally the afterlife, literally where we came from, where we're going to go after all of us die. It's a wonderful afterlife, so that's the good news. And yet the afterlife is typically described in a way that as near-death experience, and I'm sure you've heard this on your show, that they may often say it's something that you can't really explain in earthly words. It is so beyond any earthly experience that earthly words used to state the experience don't really do it justice. There's so much more. There's just a different dimension. So I think given all that, we continue to listen to near-death experiences. We continue to learn. We learn about that afterlife. We learn about that greater unseen reality. It's certainly very exciting to research that, very exciting to learn more and more as we go on. But like I said earlier, I think you, me, everybody listening to the show we're all pioneers. We're all at the very beginning. There's more things to learn, exciting things to learn, and it's just a remarkable voyage of discovery for all of us that we share.
One thing that even perplexes me is that even something simple like going through the tunnel, because I have a significant number of people that will describe it as moving from one dimension to another dimension, and then some of them will say that's the act of the consciousness or soul leaving the body.
Mhm.
Where are you at on that?
Yeah, good question. The tunnel is described in about 20% of near-death experiences in my group. The tunnel, as they enter it, the tunnel is variably described. They're typically moving at high speed. The tunnel may be big, little, but in spite of their movement, it's essentially never claustrophobic. So I'll say that. Very commonly in the tunnel, at the end of the tunnel, they describe a light. Not like a light like we know in our earthly lives. It's a mystical light, often described as beautiful, unearthly in its appearance, or maybe it's be a sense of personality or consciousness behind it. But I would have to say, yes, for those near-death experiences going through a tunnel, since that's one of the earlier things that happens in a near-death experience for so many, that seems to be at least symbolic or in some way actual, that they are traveling, transitioning their consciousness from this earthly realm into something different. At the end of that tunnel, as I'm sure you've noticed from so many guests, that's where they're in an unearthly realm. Almost invariably at the end of the tunnel, there can be, it's been called a heavenly realm, I think very aptly. Over and over, you and I'm sure have heard people describe beauty with words that don't fit on earth. There may be earth-like things, and yet colors may be described as so beautiful they have no earthly correlate. Music there may be so beautiful that you can't possibly exist on earth. There may be buildings, they may encounter deceased relatives there. Typically, they're feeling overwhelming feelings of peace and love among the two most common words used. And again, there's that beautiful unearthly light. And interestingly, don't forget, Jeff, even at the end of that tunnel, even though they're suffering from a life-threatening event that threatens to kill them, essentially never are they, as they enter the tunnel and exit it, no pain. They're feeling overwhelming peace, love, and often in those unearthly realms, very commonly they say, "This is my real home. Feels so familiar. It's there, and I've arrived." And they no longer believe that their earth is that they knew for years to decades of their prior earthly life. They immediately recognize that this unearthly, beautiful realm is indeed their real home.
I want to add to that, Dr. Long, that what's so reassuring or nice to hear is that so many experiencers leave their body before the trauma of pain is felt, like someone who was going to get hit by a car. Just before they got hit, they're already outside of their body, so they didn't experience that pain.
Absolutely. I see the same thing too. I find that also very reassuring. If you've had friends, family, or loved ones that had a traumatic event and ultimately died, what you just shared there is incredibly reassuring. I think we can believe that in a universe ruled by love, which is one of the most common concepts that people that have near-death experiences bring back, that it's not surprising that they would, if they're going to go through a terminal life-ending event here on Earth, that it would be done as lovingly as possible, and they didn't suffer nearly as bad as we would all be afraid of. I think that's true for so many people.
I've had a significant number of guests wind up in a place which we call the black void.
Mhm.
Have you seen that? And if so, what do you think that place is?
Sure. The void is not at all unusual. Probably on average, people are in an area where there's darkness. Now, that may sound frightening to people, but the significant majority of people in that void sort of aren't frightened. They feel safe. They may feel another presence around there unseen. Often in a void, they may be puzzled. They may look around and wonder what all's going on. But very commonly, that's an earlier part of what happens in a near-death experience. It's fairly common when they're in that void and sort of wondering what's going on. It's again sort of like a transition, I think, for some people with NDEs, but a fairly common exit from the void is they see a pinpoint of light off in the distance, and then the light gets closer, brighter. I don't know if the light's coming to them or they're moving toward the light or both. But often the void experience ends when they enter that light, that unearthly or heavenly realm, and that's kind of an interesting transitionary part of the experience.
Another common experience I've seen, which I find fascinating, is some people wind up in a room, kind of like a waiting room, and they're there, and at that place, it's common for them to be told that they need to come back. But still, it's nothing mystical, it's nothing heavenly, it's a room. What are your thoughts on that?
That's great. Yeah, Jeff, it's like we share a brain. I've seen lots of those too. And again, commonly these are sort of events that occur early on in the near-death experience, or it may even be the only event, but it's not unusual for them to be in a room, again, variably described, windows or yes or no, other beings, yes or no. But it's in a room like that. Seems to be, once again, sort of a transitionary state. Sometimes, not real often, but sometimes they go on and enter that unearthly or heavenly realm, and there's a lot more to see and be aware of. But as you say, very commonly they're in that room, and they may from there be sent back to their body involuntarily, or they may be given a choice. Some people, as you've noticed, they are given a choice. Now, this is interesting. In my research, if people are given a choice when they're in an unearthly realm, like a room or in that unearthly realm, the significant majority of people having a near-death experience, when they first get the choice, often from other spiritual beings around them, they do not want to return to the earthly body. Isn't that amazing? Friends, family, loved one, their whole life, typically for decades of their prior life, and it is so enthralling, such a strong sense that I'm really home, so free of pain, such a strong sense of unity with everything, of love. Typically their consciousness is accelerated, and they may be cognitively aware of things far beyond what we could do in our earthly physical bodies. So it's not hugely surprising that they really often will argue with others to stay in that unearthly or heavenly realm or even that room. But ultimately, when they make that decision, they're sent back. And that's difficult, I might add, for loved ones of people that have near-death experiences like that to get. You were willing to leave and die. And you really have to explain to people, yes, you'll understand when your time comes, hopefully a long time down the line. That's just how gripping and compelling these unearthly realms are, how strongly people feel that sense of love, connection, and the sense that it's their real home.
Yeah, I think that some of them forget even about this life. They forgot who they were. They don't even care about this past life. It seems that as soon as they remember a family member, it's like they instantly come back. Like they just happen to remember, oh, I've got children. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden they're back.
Yeah, good point. When in my study of near-death experiences, if they're offered a choice and decide to come back, the number one reason is children. It's their children, and sometimes they may be aware that of their children. They may be shown that their children will have a very difficult life without their presence in the children's life. They also come back for spouses, or simply because they have an undefined work that needs to be done, are some of the major reasons people that give a choice, literally, why would they leave heaven to return to earth? Those are probably about the top three reasons that people given a choice will choose to come back to earth.
Now, Dr. Long, I'm sure over the 20 years that you've been doing this, you've thought about this a lot and probably even changed your mind many times. But what are we doing here, and why do we keep coming back over and over again?
Right. That's a really good question. First of all, I would emphasize our earthly lives are profoundly meaningful, way more than we might know. For example, people that have near-death experience as a result of suicide almost never try suicide again if they have a near-death experience, because it's part of the near-death experience they vividly grasp, not because someone told them, that because they experienced and know it firsthand, that our earthly lives, often while profoundly difficult, are profoundly meaningful and significant. So, sort of globally, there seems to be lessons that we need to learn here. In the afterlife, it's not a geographically separate three-dimensional physical realm like we know on Earth. Time essentially doesn't exist there. It's non-physical. Movement, communication is non-physical. And yet here on Earth, it's very physical. So we are literally experiencing things and difficulties that we could not experience in the afterlife. In an afterlife, when people encounter other beings there, they're essentially never sick, hungry, tired, have any of the difficulties we have here on life. So as one near-death experiencer said, and I think it's aptly put, this is the boot camp of our eternal spiritual existence. There's just certainly some things here that we have to experience to understand, and we can bring back and share that knowledge in the afterlife with others. So we're literally the people that are learning lessons here, understanding things that requires a physical, earthly, and often for everybody, very commonly difficult life existence for us to really, if you will, in the afterlife, have a true omniscient or all-encompassing knowledge, not because we guessed it or somebody told us, but because we as spirits have actually experienced it and know full well.
Why do you think some people are so skeptical about NDEs?
Oh, sure. I sort of was too when I started over 20 years ago. This is so beyond anything you hear in your earthly life. I'd never had a near-death experience. I'd never experienced anything remotely like that. And so I understand skeptics. I think burden of proof is on the people that researchers like me to prove the reality of near-death experiences because it's such a different experience. It points to an afterlife. It points to something profoundly important. I fully accept that responsibility of carrying the burden of proof about the reality of near-death experiences. So I think the main reason that there are skeptics, number one, probably the main reason is they haven't bothered to go look at the profound evidence that underlie the reality of near-death experience from my own and many, many other researchers. By the way, as a quick aside, in the scholarly academic literature, there are over 200 scholarly papers published in some of the leading medical and scientific journals about near-death experience. So this isn't fringe. It's not like you can't find scholarly peer-reviewed literature in leading journals. So it's there. So I think a lot of skeptics, number one, don't really choose to learn about near-death experiences. And I think number two, the other big problem with skeptics is it's just so different from their materialistic worldview that they just can't let go of what they've believed all their life. I mean, it's kind of a huge paradigm shift. You go from being a materialist and thinking the only thing that can happen in your perceptions is in the physical brain to realizing that's not true at all from near-death experience evidence. So that's a big shift for people. And some people that are skeptics have believed that all their life, and all the people around them believed it. And it's just a little bit difficult to let go of that personal beliefs they've had all their life, reinforced by everybody around them, and accept this startling evidence. I can tell you, we hear from all sorts of people that have had near-death experiences that were skeptics before, profound skeptics even. After the near-death experience, almost uniformly, they accept that. In fact, I asked a survey of people having near-death experiences. 834 near-death experiencers were surveyed and asked about what they thought about the reality of their near-death experience at the current time. And it was right about 98% said their experience was definitely real. So, having a near-death experience is believing a near-death experience. For everybody else, like me, you just have to look at the evidence.
Most of the people, when I ask, will say that the other side is actually more real than here,
Yeah.
and here is a dream.
Absolutely. Over and over. If I had a nickel for every time I heard that concept, I could retire and stop working full time. But no, you're absolutely right. People, when they're having a near-death experience, again, in that, especially in the unearthly afterlife, the more detailed near-death experiences, they have what's often what's described as universal knowledge. They may be aware of knowledge far beyond anything that they ever knew in their life. And it bugs me a little bit when they say, oh, it's simple, I should have known, how did I forgot? Because, well, none of us around here know it. But they're aware of everything, how it all fits together, the universe, in a way they couldn't possibly have understood on Earth. Now, in my early research, I went, well, gosh, come on, tell me some of that. What'd you learn? Bring back some great discovery for me. And one near-death experiencer put it, I think, very succinctly, helped me to understand it. He said, in the afterlife, it's an ocean of knowledge that we have. And when you return to your earthly body, it's trying to put that ocean of knowledge in the teacup of our human brain. And you can't retain it. It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So, certainly, people on the other side, very commonly, they have that, they feel it's home. They may be in the presence of deceased loved ones, joyous reunions, beautiful Earth-like landscapes, buildings, overwhelming sense of peace, love, connection, and having that universal knowledge. You can just see how gripping it is for people to have a near-death experience, to have, especially the detailed near-death experiences, to have all that going on.
I think the closest I've come to this type of an experience is I was using my son's VR device. I don't know if you've ever used one, but it was really amazing. For a while, I was in a dance club, and it was like, I guess I was really there. And then I was like at the beach at a pool party. And then the craziest thing was I decided, okay, when I took it off, it was like, oh, I'm back here again. And I figured the NDE must be something like that.
I think it really is, to be a part. By the way, your viewers may see off in that direction, that's a VR pole. I have VR set up right in this room. So yeah, I've done that. And especially early on with VR, I mean, it's totally immersive. I mean, you take it off and it's like, you take some time to get reoriented because it's such a gripping, engaging world. I mean, you're there, that's your reality in VR and not Earth. I mean, you can't see anything in Earth, hear anything in Earth. You're interacting with a completely virtual world and boom, then you have to come back. I think that may be for you and I, Jeff, that may be about as close as we can get to sort of first person conceptualizing what near death experiencers go through when they're in that unearthly realm that is just so beautiful and wonderful and non-earthly, and then return and boom, just like we experienced.
I want to ask you a few questions, and I hope this doesn't make you too uncomfortable. But what's popular on YouTube now is that people are talking that this realm that we live in is a simulated reality. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, define simulation. I mean, this is a subset of reality. The greater reality is that in the afterlife. So this is, I think, real in a sense. I don't buy the simulation because I think our friends, family, loved ones, the life we lead, the decisions we made is really helping us to grow in our eternal spiritual selves. So how can you say that's not real? Because it impacts, I think, not only ours, but I think all others that we're connected with spirituality in some unseen way that we can't see on earth, where we all feel that separation. So first of all, I think that you have to look at what the outcome of earthly life is. It's growing, it's experiencing things we can't otherwise experience. I think the main scientific consensus is that this is not a simulation. I think that's an interesting possibility. But hey, Jeff, it's not falsifiable. I mean, I don't know of any good way that you can scientifically falsify that we're living in a simulation. So that's probably going to be around for years to generations. And if we don't find any good evidence to support it, that'll probably go down the YouTube click button. So, but that's how I think. I can't say we don't. I just say best evidence is that we are not in a simulation. That this is real, and you especially don't want people to say, "Oh, we're in a simulation, so my life's not meaningful. What I do doesn't matter." That's not true at all. There's no shred of evidence in near-death experiences that would support that concept.
Are you on? Do you? Let me see how I want to rephrase this. Do you believe that our consciousness is separate from the body in some non-local field? Or do you believe that plus the consciousness even creates the body as well?
Yeah, wow, these are tough questions that we could spend hours talking about. So, please, I apologize in advance for the brevity of this and sort of the focus on a specific answer. But near-death experiences, I briefly mentioned a life review earlier, where you may see some or even all of your prior life. A small percentage of these life reviews describe while they're seeing their life review during their NDE, they're aware of what the other person interacting with them in their earthly life was thinking, even though they had no clue about that during their earthly life. So the only possible way that could exist is if there's sort of a collective consciousness. In other words, there's some fairly good evidence from that. And by the way, may I add, when they are aware of what other people were thinking during their life review, anytime they ever check it out or explore or think about that, once again, it's invariably accurate. So as usual in near-death experiences, it's a part of a greater reality. So that's some very strong evidence that we have a collective consciousness, but that consciousness doesn't exist. That collective shared consciousness is not existing in our physical brain. I mean, we can't know what other people are thinking around us, almost never, essentially. So, but there seems to be that very vivid, comprehensive, complete sharing or collective consciousness. So I would say, yeah, there's some good evidence for that. As far as consciousness shaping the physical body, there's some dang interesting research on that. Once again, I think what we don't know outweighs what we do know. And there's some very interesting things. I mean, if people have certain mindsets, you can do MRI imaging of the brain or even functional imaging of the brain, and you'll see that it can change their brain. Their portions of the brain may increase in size or decrease in size. So I think that's just one microcosm of an example about a field of study, which I think is going to be fascinating too. So that's about all I want to say on that.
I'm sure going through your research and your reports, there are quite a few people that encounter other beings that are non-human on the other side. Have you thought about that and thought that maybe on the other side it's like the cantina of Star Wars where there's all kinds of beings there?
Okay. Yes, as a matter of fact, I've thought of that. I was recently in a big conference called Contact in the Desert. We had over 2,000 people there. And I presented as a part of my talks there the near-death experiences that while they had their near-death experience, they actually visited other planets in this physical universe. These were very detailed observations of life on non-earthly planets. For example, one person who we had actually brought in an audio from part of my talk while I was there described visiting a world that was entirely water, and there's no land on it, and yet scientists now say, yeah, that's distinctly possible. There was another near-death experiencer who I quoted, and they were in a much more advanced world than they are here, and the people in this advanced world were somewhat appalled and, if you will, grossed out that as he communicated with them, well, they asked him directly, how do you get your energy? And he said, well, basically, I eat food. And they became aware that we on Earth kill living things, plants and animals. And they were kind of appalled and said, well, we get it directly from source. So again, just mind-boggling implication. I mean, you couldn't even make that up. I mean, these are real ways that that are very plausible for life to exist on other planets. So we have a small series of these. So indeed, near-death experiences providing significant evidence of life on other planets in the physical universe with some fairly significant detailed observations. Beings in the unearthly realm, again, very often described as quite variably, and I have no doubt that they may be encountering beings that had their physical existence on some other planet, and in the unearthly realm, heavenly realm, they just retain that non-earthly appearance. And I might add, whenever these unearthly appearing spiritual beings are encountered in a near-death experience in this heavenly realm, essentially always they're not frightening or scary. I mean, you feel that strong sense of love, connection, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really kind of if you will, one more interesting, beautiful facet of near-death experiences.
It's amazing that you mentioned the water planet, because I've had a handful of guests that go to other planets. And I think almost every one of them, or nearly every one of them, went to the water planet.
Okay, wow, because these are very unusual near-death experiences that describe that. I'd love to communicate with them. The near-death experiencer, I don't know if this correlates with what you saw, but they encountered beings there that they shared love or attention. They were curious about this near-death experiencer. The highest level of intelligent beings were near the surface of the water, and as this near-death experiencer went deeper and deeper, they were less intelligent beings and sort of seemed like mollusk-like animals, and they were some food sources from way down deep. So I don't know if that correlates. That I would, certainly, I believe there's way, way more than just a single water planet in the known physical universe. But that would be fascinating if what you heard from these guests correlated in any significant way with what I've heard from this one near-death experiencer that visited that planet.
They never described what you were saying about the different level of evolution. I think they mostly would say that the beings there are kind of fish-like beings. And that's what the most I got out of that. Another thing, since we're on there and you seem comfortable with it, is quite a few, I don't know about quite a few, but there's a significant number of people that have contacted ETs or aliens on the other side as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, on the other side, in the unearthly heavenly realms, there's certainly, well, first of all, we already have the evidence from direct observations that there are ETs. ETs exist, and I think there's a growing amount of evidence. I think even the United States government is finally, relenting and saying, gee, there's things, lots of observations we can't explain, and probably you and I and most everybody reads them and goes, well, I think that's pretty obvious that represents an ET because there's no other explanation, and objects move outside of the possible physics of this earthly existence. Well, anyway, but yeah, we do have some people encounter ETs, and again, it's just I guess another perspective on this. Again, the ETs would be joyous reunions, very pleasant interactions. I think if you believe, as I do, that we live in an infinite universe, you'd be on thin ice to say something can't happen, something's not possible in a near-death experience. So bring on the ETs. It's just an important part of a small percentage of near-death experiences, and yet I think gives us a fascinating glimpse in that greater reality that we can all learn from and continue our search for life on other planets in other ways. Certainly is it's certainly a stimulus to keep that search up. There, ET is out there. We just need to try to find them.
What do you say to the skeptics that say an NDE is just a DMT experience or some random neurons firing in the brain?
Okay, let's start with DMT. DMT, or dimethyltryptophan, is a fairly common skeptical argument. People say, gee, DMT reproduces near-death experiences, so therefore that proves it's a chemically induced, brain chemistry induced experience. Real simple answer. On my website, NDERF.org, thousands of near-death experiences. Go peruse 20 or 30 of those, just write down the list. And then go over to another website called erowid.org, EROWID.org. There you will find literally hundreds of people who shared first person their DMT experiences. If you do what I have done and try reading 20 or 30 of those yourself and compare it to near-death experiences, you will immediately realize they're completely different experiences. I mean, I don't know how more accurate I can do. It's comparing apples with apples. So I don't know how much more direct I can be, but DMT experiences are much more likely to be hallucinatory, events skip around like dreams, much more likely to be frightening, much more likely to have unreal types of imagery than near-death experiences. And again, that's what I'm saying, but you can see for yourself if you go do that. But in addition to that, many, well, not a huge number, but certainly quite a few at this point of the 4,000 people that have shared near-death experiences with me have also used psychotropic or brain-acting drugs. They may have some experience with that. You name it, I've heard it. Psilocybin, DMT, LSD. And the great majority of people that have had a near-death experience and have used these illicit drugs, including DMT, the great majority will say these are not the same experiences. Maybe DMT, induces a little bit of an emotional reaction. Maybe there's a hint of light, but by and large, the people that have had both experiences say they're significantly different. So, I don't know what more to say to the people, the skeptics, other than that. I know there's all sorts of YouTubes to the contrary, but if you want to know the truth, those are two excellent ways to do that.
My previous guest cited someone else's research to me that basically said that you can cut out any part of the brain and you will not lose long-term memory. And he kind of described it as your long-term memory is stored in, I believe he called it the quantum hologram. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a physician. I've been trained in neurology or brain function. That's not true, I'm afraid. There are portions of the brain that involve long-term memory. There are actually neurologic functions that you can have. There's, I believe it's called, I'm forgetting the actual medical name at this point, Korsakoff. You can have a certain damage to your brain that eliminates short-term memory. So you can only remember long-term things, but you can't, I mean, you could literally meet someone 5 minutes later, not have any recollection of that. So that's one thing. And yes, there's portions of the brain, brain is stored in memories are stored in a portion of the brain called the hippocampus. And you can actually, yes, if you destroy that, you can absolutely destroy long-term memories. Unfortunately and tragically, we see that all the time with Alzheimer's. What disappears is their memories from long, long ago. So significant brain dysfunction will significantly impair and diminish or eliminate long-term memories, unfortunately. So that's a fairly common medical, tragically common medical observation.
All right. You are a runner-up winner of the Bigelow Contest. I want to congratulate you on that. And can you tell people about that contest?
Yeah, sure. In 2021, a prominent billionaire, whose name was Bigelow, put out a contest with a huge amount of prize money with the goal to find the best scientific evidence of, as they put it, survival of consciousness after death. That's basically life after death, a conscious existence after we physically die on Earth. So because the prize money was so huge, they had over 1,000 people submit essays. a panel of 6 very qualified judges looked over, selected a little over 200 of those essays to see who would win the contest. So mine was among that. I had we've discussed a lot of that, but I had an essay, and these are 25,000 word essays. So these were like half a book. And I published my research, much of which we've talked about here today. And so I was very honored to be in the runner-up group and won $50,000. And I almost didn't win it because I was flipping through the email and you see you won $50,000 prize. And I had my finger on the mouse to go, yeah, sure. And then I went, wait a minute, and read it. And it was for real for the first time in my life. So I was honored to be in the runner-up group and get a huge prize as being some of the top scientific evidence of life after death. And I might add, to have that many people submit essays, sort of the who's who of consciousness researchers or afterlife researchers from a variety of disciplines in the world. This was about the toughest peer review, scholarly peer review from that panel of judges imaginable. So for my essay to be selected, that really, had to go through a very, very tough peer review, validating its content. So that was a real honor. And certainly there were, other good essays about scientific evidence of life after death. Another prominent European group looked at all of the winners in that contest, and they selected the essays that appeared to have the best scientific evidence. And I was honored to be in the top 6 of all the essays submitted and that won any prize for having the best scientific evidence. Actually, 5 of the 6 essays that group selected for the strongest scientific evidence of life after death involved near-death experiences. So again, validating that there's a lot of other lines of evidence in different types of experiences, philosophy, et cetera, scholarly disciplines that point to life after death. But consistent with that review, number one, in my opinion, seems to be near-death experiences for giving the best scientific evidence that when our earthly lives end, there's much more that lies beyond death's door for all of us. It's a wonderful afterlife.
To get back to the brain for a moment, I'm sure you're aware of Savant Syndrome, like people like in the movie Rain Man, where they can, spill a box of toothpicks on the ground and immediately look at it and know how many are there.
Yeah.
But there is also acquired Savant Syndrome, which happens to people after some kind of neurological impact. And many of the people that I speak to have psychic-like abilities after their NDE. And so I'm wondering if they have some kind of version of acquired Savant Syndrome.
Boy, that's exactly what I was saying earlier, that what we don't know outweighs what we do know. These psychic phenomena are extremely unstudied. Many people describe that, as I'm sure you've heard from your guests. So it's a fascinating thing to really drill down on and try to learn more about. I think one of the more common psychic manifestations after a near-death experience is that they're simply more loving. They're more aware of other people. They're more attuned. They're paying attention to those verbal and nonverbal clues, and they can appear psychic in the sense that they may be aware of what other person's thinking, what their emotional state is, in a way much better than they could before their near-death experience, just because of what you call after effects, how they've changed. So I know that's part of it. But as far as some of these fascinating things, electrical phenomena, what does it all mean? There was actually one good study published relatively recently in the Journal of Near-Death Studies. And, again, they said, well, this is suggestive, but not proof. So just cries out for more research. I'll be going to the world's biggest NDE conference this upcoming late August, and I will be sure to ask the hotel we're all in if there's any unexpected electrical activity that's gone on during the time of the conference, which would corroborate there's some kind of psychic, mystical phenomena going on that we need to explore further. So stay tuned.
There are some people that just have a lot of trouble processing their NDEs. What kind of advice do you have for those people?
Wow, great question. I mean, first of all, you nearly die. There's that close brush with death. So, often people have to first line of duty is to recover from what nearly killed them. So you have that, and then you've had an experience completely different from any of your other earthly experiences. And so on top of that, some people may be reluctant to share or process their near-death experience early on because they're afraid it will scare their friends, family, and loved ones, where they'll realize, gee, you were really that close to death. So that's another barrier. In this day and age, most people have heard of near-death experience, and actually most people accept it. Interestingly, the majority of the public does. So, including healthcare professionals. So if you're at the hospital, you're much more likely to find doctors or nurses that are aware of near-death experience and are supportive. Thank goodness for the internet, and thank goodness, Jeff, for shows like yours. So all of these are extremely important in helping people learn the truth about near-death experience and process their own personal experience. So one thing I tell near-death experiencers that have had a near-death experience: be patient. It's fairly common for people to take literally years to fully integrate and process their near-death experience. I mean, if they've had an experience they can't express in words, that is beyond earthly language, well, you can imagine it's just going to take them some time to think about it, understand it, and then integrate those often new values. They're more loving, less materialistic, obviously, no less fear of death. It can literally take years for most people after near-death experience to fully understand or better understand their experience and incorporate those typically observed changes, the after effects in their life. So be patient. It's okay. Certainly listen to shows like this, read books, visit the NDERF.org website. And very importantly, for those that have had a near-death experience, you're not alone. Millions of people around the world have had near-death experiences, and it's a real experience.
One of the things that I never considered happening before I started this show is that this show helps so many people. And what I mean by that is so many people write to me that are out there grieving over the loss of a loved one or their own death anxiety, and that this show brings them peace. So what advice do you have for the people that are out there that are suffering?
Yeah, we're all going to suffer, but we're going to suffer intensely when that loved one that we have in our life dies, especially if it's unexpected. So grief is common. And yet shows like this and the entire body of scholarly literature about near-death experience all converges down on a wonderful and incredibly reassuring message that we don't really die, that we're all eternal souls, that we existed, and we're going to go on existing in a much, much better place than here on Earth. As I've told people that have that death anxiety, for those that do die at the end of our earthly life, when they've passed, they're in a much better place than you and I. And every shred of evidence from near-death experience all points to that. So I think that helps grieving people. It may help a little bit, it may help a lot. It may help later on as they continue to think about it. But I think for those people that at all believe that understanding near-death experiences, shows like this, are going to be helpful to their grief process, just keep listening to the show, keep reading. And I think the more you understand near-death experiences and its reality, gripping reality, that death is not the end, I think that's helping people to get over the grief process and go forward and live without their loved one, with every shred of evidence in near-death experience being that we will be reunited with our loved ones again for eternity.
Dr. Long, if people want to go to your website, NDERF.org, can they read through all 4,000 cases there?
If they're incredibly diligent, yes. They're all posted there. When you go to the website, you see we don't have anything for sale. We're not soliciting donations because we consider the integrity of the website to be so important that what people shared freely with us, we share freely with the rest of the world. But yeah, if you go there, and actually, if you're curious, if you go to the NDERF.org website and go to experiences, there's a sub drop down menu that says exceptional experiences. I'll bet for those of you that want to really learn about in-depth, detailed near-death experiences, shoot, you just have to read 10 of those right in a row, any 10 of those from that list we have of what we call our exceptional NDEs, and you will learn as much as you could from reading books. Often several books on this, by just reading it from the original source, people that actually had it. So absolutely, anybody that can read any of the near-death experiences shared for over 20 years for free, anytime, any place.
I mentioned one of your books in the beginning, but you also have a second one called God in the Afterlife. What is that book about?
Sure. Over and over, near-death experiences describe meeting God or a supreme being or an all. Now, near-death experiencers often describe God as being an earthly word that doesn't come close to describing that being they encountered in their near-death experience, that is beyond words and beyond language. And yet I see these descriptors of, if you will, a supreme ultimate intelligence, a part of the afterlife, that I was interested in, ended up with over 270 encounters or people being aware of God during their near-death experience. So this book has a fascinating discussion about, first of all, God being incredibly non-judgmental, God being profoundly loving, typically are often associated with that beautiful light, often them feeling literally connected or unified with this source, if you will, or other people use that term. So very, very beautiful description of that sort of unifying, beautiful, loving presence on the other side that I'm sure will be a part of all of our afterlife journeys.
If people want to find your books, do they get them on your website or on Amazon?
Yeah, that's good. On the website, we literally don't have anything for sale. You'd have to go look. So quickest thing to do would just be to go Amazon and look for Jeffrey Long, and you'll find a couple books, those top two books that I did. But gosh, Jeff, this has been such a great interview. If you don't buy my books, don't worry. We've really hit some of the major points of those books right here for free.
Thank you. Well, do you have anything else that you're working on that you want people to know about?
Yeah, I'm still continuing. It's tough. I'm a full-time physician, and dang, believe me, that takes a lot of my time. But I'm still, whenever I have time, I love doing shows like this, as you noticed. I'm still continuing my research. I very recently had a near-death experience, very profound near-death experience, or lots of observations of sort of how the bigger picture of the universe, God, the afterlife, how it all fits together. And so I'm intrigued enough by what she wrote that I'm thinking about doing my own sort of, if you will, big picture. What can we learn? What are we observing consistently in near-death experiences as sort of a way we can learn not only about near-death experiences based on evidence from, and by the way, what's, basic tenet of science, what's real is consistently observed. And we see overwhelming consistency in what people are saying. So I think that would help us to sort of codify these profound messages, understanding in near-death experiences. And that could also be a path for us to learn about other spiritual experiences and help characterize them and compare them to near-death experiences. So that's a major interest of mine right now. I'm also at our big annual near-death experience conference in August. I'll be talking about what we call after effects, or what changes that are very consistently observed in people that have NDEs. So those are a couple of my big projects going on right now.
That's great. Well, Dr. Long, before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Sure, that's easy. I encourage people to read about near-death experiences, listen to shows like this. If at all possible, find somebody who's had a near-death experience. There's no substitute for actually talking with them. But please understand, multiple lines of evidence are all converging on the reality that we're much more than our physical earthly bodies. We are, each and every one of you, eternal souls. We've existed before, will exist later, that there is an afterlife, a wonderful afterlife, and that's for all of us.
Dr. Long, thank you for that message, and thank you for being my guest.
Been a real pleasure. Great show.
Thank you. Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.